The rusted lock snapped easier than Frank Martinez expected. After 40 years swinging hammers and reading blueprints, the retired construction worker knew buildings like most people knew their own faces. But this condemned warehouse on Detroit's east side felt different. Wrong. He'd bought it for $100 at a city auction, figuring he'd gut it, flip it, and pad his meager retirement fund. The realtor had seemed almost desperate to get rid of it. 3 floors down, in what should have been solid foundation, Frank's flashlight revealed a hidden basement room. Inside, dozens of newspaper clippings about Sarah Chen, the prosecutor who'd vanished 15 years ago. Her photo smiled from every wall, but it was the recent pictures that made his blood freeze, surveillance shots of Frank himself taken over the past month. Someone had been watching him since the day he'd shown interest in this building. Frank's phone had no signal. The basement door had somehow locked behind him, and somewhere in the darkness above, footsteps echoed through the empty warehouse. But why had someone wanted Frank specifically to find this room? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank's weathered hands trembled as he swept the flashlight beam across the walls again, hoping he'd imagined those surveillance photos. No such luck. There he was in crisp detail, walking his dog Rosie past the warehouse 3 weeks ago, studying the building's exterior with a contractor's eye. Another shot showed him at the auction house, raising his bidder paddle. A third captured him shaking hands with the realtor outside the building just 2 days prior. Someone had orchestrated this entire sequence of events. The basement room was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, with concrete walls that looked newer than the rest of the foundation. Frank ran his calloused fingers along the edges where the walls met. The mortar was different here, a shade lighter. This space had been carved out and sealed after the original construction, probably within the last 20 years. Sarah Chen's face stared at him from every angle. The newspaper clippings were meticulously organized in chronological order, starting with her appointment as assistant district attorney and ending with the final articles about the investigation going cold. Between them, dozens of candid photographs showed her leaving the courthouse, grabbing coffee, jogging in Belle Isle Park, the same obsessive surveillance that had been turned on Frank. He moved closer to examine a manila folder sitting on a makeshift desk, a sheet of plywood balanced on concrete blocks. Inside, he found copies of police reports, witness statements, and evidence logs from Sarah's case. These weren't the sanitized summaries that made it into newspapers. These were internal documents, complete with crime scene photos and detective notes that should have been locked away in police files. Frank had lived in Detroit his entire life, but Sarah Chen's disappearance had barely registered with him 15 years ago. He'd been consumed with work, putting in 12-hour days to support his family after his wife Maria's cancer diagnosis. The case of a missing prosecutor had seemed like something from another world. Now, studying the documents by flashlight, the details hit him with uncomfortable clarity. Sarah had been investigating a corruption case involving city contracts when she vanished, the same kind of municipal construction contracts Frank's company had bid on for decades. The footsteps above grew louder, more deliberate. Someone was moving through the warehouse with purpose, not the random creaking of an old building settling. Frank clicked off his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall, heart hammering against his ribs. He'd been a fool to come here alone. The smart play would have been to bring his son Miguel, or at least tell someone where he was going. But retirement had made him restless, eager to prove he could still handle himself, now that independence might cost him everything. In the darkness, Frank felt along the walls searching for another exit. The concrete was solid, professionally finished. Whoever built this room had known what they were doing. He found electrical outlets, suggesting the space had been wired for long-term use. A dehumidifier hummed quietly in one corner, keeping the documents preserved. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a shrine. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Frank held his breath, counting seconds that stretched like hours. A door creaked open somewhere above, followed by the sound of someone descending stairs. Not the main staircase Frank had used. These footsteps were coming from a different direction entirely. Frank clicked his flashlight back on and grabbed the manila folder, stuffing it inside his jacket. Whatever was happening here, whatever connection existed between him and Sarah Chen's disappearance, he needed evidence. The police would have to believe him if he could show them this room. The basement door handle rattled. Someone was testing it from the outside. Frank pressed himself deeper into the shadows, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. After 4 decades of construction work, his hands were still strong, his reflexes decent for a man pushing 70. A key turned in the lock. The morning sun cast long shadows across the warehouse floor as Frank pushed open the heavy metal door, its hinges protesting with a rusty screech that echoed through the cavernous space. He'd barely slept, his mind churning with possibilities for the building's renovation. At 65, this was his last shot at securing a comfortable retirement, and he intended to make every square foot count. Frank pulled out his measuring tape and notebook, determined to map out the space properly. The warehouse was larger than he'd initially estimated, nearly 8,000 square feet of raw potential. He could already envision the exposed brick walls cleaned and sealed, modern lighting fixtures suspended from the industrial ceiling, and polished concrete floors reflecting carefully placed windows. As he worked his way along the eastern wall, Frank noticed something odd. The measurements didn't match the building's exterior dimensions. According to his calculations, there should be another 15 feet of space behind this wall. He ran his weathered hands along the brick surface, searching for any indication of a hidden entrance. The bricks felt solid until his fingers reached a section near the corner where the mortar seemed newer, a slightly different shade of grey. Frank pressed against it experimentally, and to his surprise, a small section gave way with a soft click. A narrow door, perfectly camouflaged within the brick pattern, swung inward on silent hinges. Cool air rushed out from the darkness beyond, carrying with it the musty scent of long-closed spaces, and something else, something that made Frank's stomach tighten with unease. He fumbled for his phone's flashlight and stepped through the doorway. The hidden room was smaller than the missing footage had suggested, perhaps 12 by 15 feet, but what it contained made Frank's breath catch in his throat. The walls were covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes, all meticulously organized and protected behind sheets of plastic. Even in the dim light from his phone, Frank could see that many of the photographs showed the same young woman, a brunette with striking green eyes and a warm smile that seemed to light up every image. Frank moved closer to examine the wall, his heart pounding as he began to read the newspaper headlines. Local teacher vanishes without trace. Search continues for missing woman. And finally, Sarah Chen case goes cold after 6 months. The dates were from 15 years ago, but Frank remembered the case well. The entire city had been captivated by the mystery of the beloved elementary school teacher who had simply disappeared one evening after leaving work. But these weren't the kind of articles a concerned citizen might clip from the newspaper. These were obsessive, detailed chronicles of every aspect of Sarah Chen's life. There were photos of her apartment building, her car, her favorite coffee shop, images that could only have been taken by someone following her, watching her daily routines with predatory patience. Frank's hands trembled as he noticed a small table in the corner, its surface covered with what appeared to be personal items: a silver bracelet, a set of car keys, a wallet. He didn't need to open the wallet to know whose identification would be inside. The evidence was methodically arranged, almost like a shrine to the missing woman. A manila folder lay open beside the personal effects, containing what looked like detailed plans and sketches. Frank leaned closer, squinting at the handwritten notes in the margins. The careful script documented Sarah's schedule, her habits, her relationships. The final entry was dated 3 days before her disappearance, Tuesday evening. Late parent conferences, will be alone in classroom until 8 p.m. Parking lot poorly lit. Perfect opportunity. The implications hit Frank like a physical blow. This wasn't just evidence of Sarah Chen's murder, this was the killer's private trophy room, preserved exactly as it had been left 15 years ago. But why here? Why in this warehouse that had been condemned and supposedly empty for years? The hidden door had opened too easily, as if it had been recently maintained. The plastic covering the evidence showed no signs of age or deterioration. Someone had been caring for this room, keeping it pristine, visiting it regularly. And if the killer was still alive, still active, Frank's discovery would not go unnoticed. As he stepped back into the main warehouse, Frank noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the dust near the hidden door. Footprints that definitely weren't his own. Someone else had been here recently. Someone who knew about the secret room and had been inside it. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Welcome to your new property, Frank. I hope you find everything interesting. We should meet soon to discuss your plans." The name on the license made him step backwards so quickly he nearly tripped. Sarah Chen, the college student whose murder had dominated headlines 15 years ago. Her body had been found in Riverside Park, but the killer was never caught. Frank remembered the case vividly. It had terrified the entire city, especially parents with daughters Sarah's age. He forced himself to examine the folders, his heart hammering against his ribs. Inside were dozens of photographs of Sarah taken from a distance, walking to class, sitting in cafes, leaving her apartment. The stalking pattern was methodical, obsessive. Maps showed her daily routes marked in red ink. There were copies of her class schedule, her work shifts at the campus bookstore, even her medical records somehow obtained from the university health center. Frank backed out of the room, his breathing shallow and rapid. He needed to call the police immediately, but first he had to get out of this building. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat now, every creak of old wood a potential footstep. As he reached for his phone to dial 911, it buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. "You seem to have found something interesting, Frank." His phone clattered to the concrete floor. Someone was watching him right now. Frank spun around, scanning the darkness beyond his flashlight's reach, but saw nothing except the familiar outlines of abandoned machinery and construction debris. Another text arrived. "Don't involve the police. We should talk first." Frank grabbed his phone and ran toward the exit, his work boots echoing through the empty warehouse. Behind him, he heard a sound that stopped him cold, the mechanical groan of the main door sliding shut, the same door he'd left propped open for exactly this reason. He was trapped. Frank fumbled for his keys, trying to remember if there was another exit. The building's blueprints had shown a rear loading dock, but he hadn't explored that section yet. His flashlight beam swept frantically across the warehouse floor as he made his way toward the back of the building, stepping carefully around piles of debris and old equipment. "Frank," the voice came from somewhere in the darkness behind him, calm and conversational. "There's no need to run. I just want to talk." Frank didn't recognize the voice, but its casual tone was somehow more terrifying than if the person had been shouting threats. He pressed himself against a concrete pillar, trying to control his breathing while he listened for footsteps. "You've seen my collection," the voice continued, closer now. "I imagine you're wondering why I kept everything there instead of destroying it. The truth is, I'm quite proud of my work. Sarah was special. She deserved to be remembered properly." Frank's phone buzzed again. "I can see your flashlight, Frank. Turn it off, and we can have a civilized conversation." Instead, Frank switched off the light and immediately moved away from his position, feeling his way along the wall toward what he hoped was the rear exit. The warehouse fell into complete darkness. Without windows, the building was like a tomb. "That wasn't very cooperative," the voice said, and now Frank could hear footsteps moving with confident purpose through the darkness. Whoever this was knew the building's layout intimately. Frank's outstretched hand found a doorframe. He felt around desperately for a handle or exit bar, his fingers tracing the cold metal until he found what felt like a push-bar mechanism. But when he pressed it, nothing happened. The door was locked or jammed. A bright flashlight beam suddenly illuminated him from across the warehouse. "There you are," Frank squinted into the harsh light, unable to make out the figure behind it. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand the situation you've stumbled into," the voice replied. "That room contains 15 years of my life's work. Documentation of a perfect crime. Sarah's murder was art, Frank. And you found my gallery." The flashlight beam moved closer. "Now we need to discuss what happens next. Because you see, I can't simply let you walk away and destroy everything I built, but I also recognize that you're an innocent man who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Frank pressed his back against the locked door, his mind racing through possibilities for escape. "I won't tell anyone. I'll sell you the building and forget I ever saw that room." A soft chuckle echoed through the darkness. "Oh, Frank, I'm afraid it's far too late for that." Frank's hands shook as he photographed every inch of the hidden room with his phone. The flash illuminated dusty corners that hadn't seen light in decades, casting eerie shadows across newspaper clippings and evidence bags. His retirement renovation had become something far more sinister. The Sofia Reyes case files were meticulously organized, spread across a makeshift desk constructed from sawhorses and plywood. Crime scene photos showed a young woman's body discovered in Riverside Park 23 years ago, her dark hair fanned across fallen leaves like spilled ink. Frank remembered the headlines: "College student, promising future, no leads." What chilled him most wasn't the gruesome documentation, but its pristine condition. No dust. Fresh coffee stains on a manila folder dated last month. Someone had been using this room recently. Frank's phone buzzed, startling him so violently he nearly dropped it. A text from an unknown number: "You shouldn't be there." His blood turned to ice. He spun around, searching the shadows beyond his phone's flashlight beam. The warehouse groaned around him, old timber settling in the October wind, but no other sounds reached his ears. Another text arrived: "Check the blue folder, bottom drawer." Frank's rational mind screamed at him to leave, call the police, forget this nightmare existed. But something deeper compelled him forward, perhaps the same stubborn curiosity that had driven him through 40 years of construction work, always needing to see what lay beneath the surface. The blue folder contained Sofia's personal effects inventory: student ID, silver bracelet, leather journal with a broken clasp. But someone had added handwritten notes in red ink. Journal pages missing. See storage unit 247, West Side Storage. Below that, an address and a key taped to the page. Frank photographed everything, his thumb trembling over the camera button. The killer wasn't just watching him, they were guiding him. But why? After more than 2 decades of successful concealment, why reveal their secrets to a random stranger? His phone rang, the sound echoing off concrete walls like a scream. "Unknown number. Don't answer," he whispered to himself, but his finger betrayed him. "Hello, Frank." The voice was calm, measured, almost gentle, neither distinctly male nor female, artificially modulated through some kind of filter. "Who is this?" Frank managed. "Someone who's been waiting a very long time for the right person to find that room. Tell me, Frank, what do you see when you look at Sofia's picture?" Frank's eyes drifted to the crime scene photos despite himself. "I see a murdered girl who deserves justice." Good answer. The police saw a statistic. Her family saw a lost cause after the first year. But you see what I hoped you'd see. You're the killer. The words felt strange on his tongue, like speaking a foreign language. "I'm someone who knows the truth. Sofia Reyes wasn't killed by the man they suspected. The real killer has been walking free for 23 years, and I need your help to stop him." Frank sank into the room's single chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. "Why me? Why not go to the police yourself?" "Because the killer is Detective Ray Morrison. He's been suppressing evidence, misdirecting investigations, and he's about to retire with full honors. The system won't stop him, but we can." Detective Morrison. Frank knew that name from the newspaper coverage he'd obsessively read after finding the room. Morrison had been the lead investigator, the face of the investigation on every news report. "You're insane. Check storage unit 247. See what Detective Morrison removed from Sophia's journal before logging it as evidence. Then decide if I'm insane." The line went dead. Frank stared at his phone, mind reeling. Everything about this felt like a trap, but the evidence around him seemed too elaborate for a simple con. The newspaper clippings showed genuine water damage and age. The crime scene photos matched what he remembered from news reports. Someone had invested serious time and money in this deception, if it was a deception. He pocketed the storage unit key and took one final look around the room. On the wall near the door, he noticed something he'd missed before, a small mirror positioned to give a view of the warehouse's main entrance. Whoever used this space could see anyone coming or going. Frank climbed back through the loose wall panel and replaced it carefully. The warehouse felt different now, pregnant with secrets and watching eyes. Every shadow could hide an observer, every sound might herald his discovery. As he walked toward his truck, Frank felt the weight of the storage unit key in his pocket like a burning coal. Part of him wanted to throw it in the nearest storm drain and pretend this afternoon never happened. But Sophia Reyes stared at him from behind his closed eyelids, young, beautiful, and forever silenced. If someone had really spent decades seeking justice for her, could Frank simply walk away? His truck door slammed with finality. He had a decision to make. "Let me get this straight," Detective Chen said, her pen hovering over a yellow notepad. "You found what you believe to be evidence related to the Angela Morrison case in a hidden room you discovered, while renovating the warehouse you purchased last week." Frank nodded, his throat dry. "That's right. Photos, newspaper clippings, personal items that look like they belonged to her." Chen leaned back in her chair, studying him with dark, calculating eyes. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe early 40s, with short black hair and the kind of intense focus that made Frank feel like she could see right through him. "Mr. Martinez, the Angela Morrison case is 23 years old, cold as ice. What makes you think what you found is connected?" Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling to the photos he'd taken before calling the police. "See for yourself." Chen took the phone, her expression shifting as she swiped through the images. Frank watched her eyebrows furrow, then lift slightly as she paused on a particular photo. "This jewelry," she said, zooming in on the image. "You didn't touch anything?" "Hell no. I watch enough TV to know better than that." Chen handed the phone back and made a note. "We'll need to send a team to process the scene. The warehouse will be off limits until further notice." Frank's stomach dropped. "For how long?" "I've got contractors scheduled, permits that expire." "Mr. Martinez, if this is legitimate evidence in a murder case, your renovation is the least of our concerns." Chen's tone was sharp but not unkind. "Tell me about the previous owner. How did you come to purchase the property?" "Estate sale. The owner died, some old guy named Harold Voss. His nephew was handling the sale, seemed eager to get rid of it fast." Chen wrote down the name, then looked up sharply. "Harold Voss. You're sure about that name?" "Yeah, why?" The coffee cup slipped from Frank's numb fingers, clattering to the floor and splashing lukewarm liquid across the linoleum. "Jesus Christ. The nephew who sold you the property. What was his name?" Frank struggled to remember. David something. David Kellerman, I think. Nice enough guy, clean cut. Met me at a coffee shop downtown to handle the paperwork. Chen was typing again, and Frank could see the concentration in her posture, the way she leaned forward like a hunter picking up a scent. "There's no David Kellerman listed as Harold Voss's next of kin in our system," she said after a moment. "In fact, according to this, Harold Voss died intestate with no known relatives." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He gripped the arms of his chair, feeling the room tilt slightly. "That's impossible. I have the deed, the transfer paperwork." Frank closed his eyes, trying to summon the memory of their brief meeting. Average height, maybe 5'10", brown hair thinning on top, wore glasses, wire-rimmed, had a small scar on his left hand between his thumb and index finger. "I noticed it when we shook hands." Chen was writing rapidly now, her pen scratching urgently across the paper. "Age?" 50, maybe 55. Hard to tell exactly. And he approached you about the sale? Chen set down her pen and looked at him directly. Mr. Martinez, I think you may have been targeted specifically. Someone wanted you to find that room. The detective's words echoed in the sudden silence of the station, mixing with the distant sounds of ringing phones and muffled conversations. Frank felt a chill creep up his spine as he realized the truth. Whoever David Kellerman really was, he'd been planning this for a long time. And somewhere out there, he was probably watching, waiting to see what Frank would do next. Frank's hands trembled as he stared at the photographs scattered across his kitchen table. The morning light streaming through his window seemed too bright, too normal for what he was looking at. Sarah Chen's face gazed back at him from a dozen different angles, candid shots taken without her knowledge, some clearly captured through telephoto lenses from considerable distances. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, but Frank couldn't bring himself to move. Each photograph told a story of obsession, of someone who had watched Sarah's every movement in the weeks before her death. There she was, leaving her apartment building, walking through the university campus, sitting alone in a cafe with a book open before her. In several shots, she appeared to be looking directly at the camera, her expression troubled, as if she sensed she was being watched. Frank picked up one particular photograph that made his stomach clench. Sarah stood at what appeared to be her apartment window, visible from the chest up, her hand pressed against the glass. Even in the grainy image, her fear was palpable. Someone had been close enough to her home to capture this intimate moment of terror. The sound of his phone ringing made Frank jump, sending several photographs fluttering to the floor. Detective Morrison's name appeared on the screen. Mr. Martinez, I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday. Have you had time to think about whether there's anything else you might have found in that warehouse? Frank stared at the evidence spread before him, his mouth dry. I told you everything I found, Detective. Are you sure about that? Because we've had some interesting developments in the Chen case. New information has come to light that suggests there might be more physical evidence out there than we originally thought. What kind of information? The kind that makes me think someone's been sitting on crucial evidence for 25 years. Someone who might be getting nervous now that we're taking another look at the case. Frank's grip tightened on the phone. I don't understand what you're getting at. Mr. Martinez, if you're holding back information because you're scared, I want you to know that we can protect you. But if you're holding back information for any other reason, that's going to be a problem. After Morrison hung up, Frank sat in his kitchen feeling the walls closing in around him. The detective's words carried an unmistakable warning, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that bringing the police into this would put him in even greater danger. Whoever had been watching him knew exactly what he'd found, knew that he was now part of their deadly game. Frank gathered the photographs and returned them to the manila envelope, his mind racing. He needed to understand who had created this collection and why it had been hidden in his warehouse. The storage room had been carefully concealed, suggesting it was meant to stay hidden indefinitely. But from whom? The police or someone else? He pulled out his laptop and began searching for information about the warehouse's previous owners. The property records showed a complex history of ownership changes, shell companies, and foreclosure proceedings stretching back decades. But one name appeared multiple times throughout the documentation: Meridian Holdings, LLC. Further research revealed that Meridian Holdings had been dissolved in 1999, just a year after Sarah Chen's murder. The company's registered agent was listed as someone named Robert Vance, but Frank could find no current information about him. It was as if Vance had vanished from public records around the same time the company was disbanded. Frank leaned back in his chair, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in his mind. Someone had used the warehouse as a hiding place for evidence that could potentially solve Sarah Chen's murder. That same someone had been watching Frank since he'd discovered their secret. The question was whether this person was the killer trying to protect himself or someone else entirely. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The detective seems very interested in your warehouse. I hope you're being careful about what you share with him." Frank's blood ran cold. The message confirmed his worst fears. Someone was monitoring his communications, watching his every move just as they had watched Sarah Chen all those years ago. He looked toward his kitchen window, suddenly aware of how exposed he was sitting at his table. Anyone with the right equipment could be watching him right now. He moved away from the window and typed a response. "Who are you? What do you want?" The reply came immediately. "I want the same thing you want, Frank. Justice for Sarah. But the police can't be trusted with what you found. Meet me tonight at 9 p.m. at the Riverside Park Pavilion. Come alone and bring everything from the storage room. It's time you learned the truth about what really happened to Sarah Chen and why her killer has never been caught." Frank stared at the message, knowing he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. He'd spent the morning pacing his kitchen, coffee growing cold as he wrestled with his options. Call the police and risk becoming the next victim, or stay silent and let a murderer continue walking free. Neither choice felt survivable. The decision was made for him when his doorbell rang at precisely noon. Through the peephole, Frank saw a woman in her 30s with short auburn hair and a determined expression. She wore a navy blazer and held up a badge. "Mr. Martinez? Detective Sarah Chen, Metro PD. I'd like to speak with you about your warehouse purchase." Frank's blood turned to ice. He considered not answering, but she'd already seen his silhouette through the frosted glass. With shaking fingers, he unlocked the door. "Detective, what can I do for you?" Chen's sharp eyes studied his face. "May I come in? I have some questions about the Riverside warehouse on 5th Street. Frank stepped aside, his mind racing. How did she know? Had someone seen him there? Was this connected to the killer's warning? In his living room, Chen settled into the armchair across from his couch. She pulled out a small notebook and pen, her movements precise and professional. "Mr. Martinez, when did you first enter the warehouse?" 2 days ago, Frank answered truthfully, right after the purchase was finalized. "And you went alone?" "Yes." Chen made a note. "Did you notice anything unusual about the property? Anything that seemed out of place or unexpected?" Frank's mouth went dry. This was it, the moment that would determine whether he lived or died. The killer's photograph sat in his jacket pocket like a loaded gun. "It's an old building," he said carefully. "Lots of dust, some water damage, nothing unexpected for a condemned property." "I see." Chen's pen stopped moving. "Mr. Martinez, are you familiar with the Angela Reeves murder case?" The name hit Frank like a physical blow. Angela Reeves, he remembered now. The case had dominated local news 5 years ago. A young woman found strangled in her apartment, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses. The investigation had gone cold after months of dead ends. "I remember reading about it in the papers," Frank managed. "Angela was found dead 5 years ago this week. We never caught her killer." Chen leaned forward slightly. "What you might not know is that Angela Reeves worked as a night security guard at your warehouse. She was employed there for 3 months before her death." Frank's vision blurred. The hidden room, the evidence, the photographs, it was all connected to this place, to Angela. The killer hadn't just murdered her. He'd created a shrine to his crime in the very building where she'd worked. That's terrible," Frank whispered. "The timing of your purchase is interesting," Chen continued. "The warehouse has been condemned for 2 years, but suddenly someone decides to buy it right before the anniversary of Angela's death, almost like they knew something we didn't." Frank felt trapped. Chen's questions were circling closer to the truth, but revealing what he'd found would expose him to the killer's wrath. The photograph in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest. "I bought it as an investment," he said. "I had no idea about any connection to a murder case." Chen studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Martinez, you seem nervous. Is there something you'd like to tell me?" Frank's hand moved unconsciously toward his jacket pocket, then stopped. In that moment, he made a choice that surprised even him. "Detective, if someone hypothetically found evidence related to an old case, what kind of protection could the police offer?" Chen's expression sharpened. That would depend on the nature of the evidence and the level of threat. Are we speaking hypothetically, or is there something specific you're concerned about? Before Frank could answer, his phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number and to detective's visit is noted. Poor choice, Frank. The blood drained from Frank's face. Chen noticed immediately. Mr. Martinez, what is it? Frank looked at the message again, then at Chen's expectant face. The killer was watching, had seen Chen arrive, knew that Frank was talking to the police. There was no going back now. Detective, he said quietly, I think you need to see something. But first, I need to know, how good is police protection these days? Chen's hand moved instinctively toward her service weapon. Mr. Martinez, are you in immediate danger? Frank looked out his front window, scanning the street for watching eyes. Somewhere out there, a killer was monitoring his every move, waiting to see what choice he'd make. I think I might be. Frank's hands trembled as he spread the photographs across his kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light. The images from the warehouse's hidden rooms stared back at him, crime scene photos, surveillance shots, and worst of all, pictures of the Hartley family that no newspaper had ever published. Personal moments, private gatherings. Someone had been watching them long before the murders. The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden in the quiet house. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs as he quickly gathered the photos, shoving them back into the manila envelope. The bell rang again, followed by 3 deliberate knocks. Mr. Martinez? It's Detective Sarah Chen. We spoke yesterday. Frank exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. He'd been expecting her call about setting up a meeting, but her showing up unannounced still rattled his already frayed nerves. He tucked the envelope under a stack of newspapers and opened the door. Detective Chen stood on his porch, her dark hair pulled back severely, eyes sharp and assessing. She wasn't alone. A tall man in an expensive suit flanked her, his presence somehow filling more space than his actual size warranted. I hope you don't mind the surprise visit, Chen said. This is FBI agent Marcus Webb. We'd like to discuss what you found at the warehouse. Frank stepped aside, gesturing them in. Agent Webb's eyes swept the living room with practiced efficiency, taking in details Frank hadn't even considered might be important. The federal agent's involvement meant this case reached far beyond a simple cold case revival. Can I get you coffee? Frank asked, mostly to buy himself time to think. That would be great, Chen replied, settling into his worn recliner. Webb remained standing, studying the family photos on Frank's mantel with an intensity that made Frank uncomfortable. In the kitchen, Frank's mind raced as he prepared the coffee. The envelope sat just 15 feet away, hidden beneath yesterday's newspaper. Should he tell them about the additional photographs? The ones that suggested the killer had been stalking the family? His instinct screamed yes, but something held him back. Maybe it was the way Webb seemed to catalogue every detail of his home, or the coincidence of them showing up just hours after his warehouse visit. Mr. Martinez, Webb's voice carried from the living room. How long have you lived in Millbrook? 42 years, Frank called back, pouring coffee into 3 mismatched mugs. Moved here right after I got married, so you would have been here when the Hartley murders occurred. Frank's hand stilled on the coffee pot handle. There was something in Webb's tone, not quite accusatory, but probing in a way that made Frank's skin crawl. Yes, I was. Terrible thing. Whole town was shaken up about it. He returned to the living room with the coffee, noting how Webb had positioned himself where he could see both the front door and the kitchen. Chen accepted her mug with a grateful nod, but Webb barely glanced at his. We're particularly interested in the room you discovered, Chen said. The preservation of evidence after 25 years suggests someone with significant knowledge of police procedures. Or someone with a lot to hide, Webb added, his pale eyes fixed on Frank. Frank settled into his usual spot on the couch, the newspaper stack and the hidden envelope within arm's reach. I wouldn't know about that. I just found the room and called you folks like any good citizen would. Of course. Webb's smile didn't reach his eyes. Though it's interesting that you decided to explore the building so thoroughly. Most people buying property for renovation would focus on structural issues, electrical systems, that sort of thing. Chen leaned forward slightly. Did you remove anything from the room, Mr. Martinez? Even something small that might have seemed insignificant? The question hung in the air like smoke. Frank could feel both of them watching him, measuring his response. The envelope seemed to pulse beneath the newspapers, as if it might spontaneously combust and reveal itself. No, he said firmly. I didn't touch anything except the light switch and the door handle. I know better than to contaminate a crime scene. Webb's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with a frown. We need to go, he told Chen, standing abruptly. But we'll definitely want to continue this conversation soon. After they left, Frank sat in his living room for a long time, listening to the house settle around him. Something about their visit felt wrong, too convenient, too probing, and Webb's questions had felt less like information gathering and more like testing whether Frank was telling the truth. He pulled out the envelope again, staring at the photographs. Someone had killed the Hartley family and hidden evidence in his warehouse for 25 years. The question that terrified him most was whether that someone now knew he'd found it. Frank's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph in his lap. The black and white image showed a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, her smile frozen in time. Sarah Chen, according to the newspaper clipping paperclip to the back, the same face that had haunted the city's headlines 15 years ago. He set the photo aside and reached for another folder from the metal filing cabinet. This one contained what looked like surveillance notes, written in meticulous handwriting, dates, times, locations, all tracking Sarah's movements in the weeks before her disappearance. The killer hadn't just stumbled upon his victim. He'd studied her, learned her routines, planned every detail. A loose floorboard creaked somewhere above him. Frank froze, his breath catching in his throat. The warehouse was old, full of settling sounds, but this felt different, deliberate. He strained to listen, but heard only the distant hum of traffic and his own thundering heartbeat. Probably just the building, he told himself, but his hands shook as he opened the next folder. Inside were dozens of photographs, not of Sarah but of other women, different ages, different backgrounds, but all sharing the same fate according to the detailed notes accompanying each image. The killer hadn't stopped with Sarah Chen. He'd been busy for years, maybe decades. Frank's stomach churned as he realized the scope of what he'd discovered. This wasn't just evidence of one murder, but a serial killer's entire collection. Trophies, records, a sick monument to violence that had been hidden beneath his warehouse for God knew how long. Another sound from upstairs made him look toward the ceiling. Definitely footsteps this time, slow and measured. Someone was in his warehouse. Frank's mind raced through possibilities. A vagrant seeking shelter, kids exploring the abandoned building, or worse, much worse, the person who'd hidden this room might have returned to find it disturbed. He fumbled for his cell phone, but the screen showed no signal. The underground location that had hidden these secrets so effectively now trapped him without communication to the outside world. Frank considered his options: stay hidden and hope whoever was upstairs would leave, or try to slip out through the passage he'd created. The footsteps stopped directly overhead, right above the hidden room. Frank held his breath, afraid even the smallest sound might give away his location. Dust motes danced in the weak light from his flashlight as silence stretched between them. Then he heard it, the scrape of furniture being moved, the same conference table he'd pushed aside to access the loose floorboards. Someone knew exactly where to look. Terror flooded through Frank's body as the implications hit him. This wasn't a random break-in. Whoever was upstairs knew about the hidden room, knew Frank had found it. The killer, because it had to be the killer, had been watching, waiting for this moment. Frank forced himself to move, gathering the most damning evidence he could carry. The photos of Sarah Chen, several files documenting other victims, anything that might help police identify this monster. He stuffed them into his jacket and moved toward the narrow opening he'd crawled through earlier. Above him, the scraping sounds grew more urgent. Boards groaned under weight as someone worked to access the room. Frank realized with growing horror that there might be another entrance he hadn't discovered, one that didn't require crawling through a gap in the foundation. He squeezed through the opening just as light flooded the hidden room behind him. A proper entrance had been revealed somewhere, and Frank could hear someone dropping down into the space he'd just vacated. Heavy breathing echoed through the chamber, along with the sound of papers being shuffled. Frank crawled as quickly and quietly as possible through the narrow space between the foundation and the floor above. Splinters caught at his clothes and exposed skin, but he pushed forward, driven by pure survival instinct. Behind him, he could hear the intruder moving through the room, no doubt discovering that someone had been there, that evidence was missing. "I know you're here, Frank." The voice was calm, almost conversational, but it cut through Frank like ice. How did this person know his name? How long had they been watching him? "You've seen something you shouldn't have," the voice continued. "But we can work this out. Just come back, and we'll talk." Frank reached the outer edge of the building and found the gap where he'd first entered the crawl space. Fresh air hit his face as he emerged into the alley behind the warehouse. Without looking back, he ran toward the street, his 65-year-old legs carrying him faster than they had in years. Only when he reached his truck did Frank allow himself to glance back at the warehouse. A light glowed in one of the upper windows, a window that had been dark when he'd arrived. Someone was still inside, still searching. Frank started the engine with shaking hands, the stolen evidence burning like fire against his chest. He had proof of multiple murders, but he also had a killer who knew his name and his face. The game had changed completely. Frank's hands trembled as he spread the photographs across his kitchen table, each image more damning than the last. The pictures showed him entering the warehouse, examining the hidden room, even sleeping in his own bed. The timestamp on the latest photo was from yesterday morning, after he'd installed the new security system. His phone buzzed. "Unknown number. You're very thorough, Frank. I admire that in a man." The voice was calm, measured, with a slight rasp that suggested years of cigarettes. Frank's throat went dry. "Who is this? Someone who's been watching you discover things that should have stayed buried." That room was sealed for a reason. Frank glanced toward his front window, the curtains drawn tight. "What do you want?" "To talk. Face to face. Tonight. The warehouse. Come alone. Or those photos of you tampering with evidence go to Detective Morrison in the morning." The line went dead. Frank stared at the phone, his mind racing. Every instinct screamed at him to call the police, but the killer's threat hung heavy in the air. Morrison already suspected him of withholding information. These photos would make him look guilty of much more than curiosity. He walked to his bedroom closet and retrieved the .38 revolver he'd kept since his security guard days. The weight felt foreign in his hands now, but the metal was still cold and real. If someone wanted to silence him, they'd find Frank Martinez wasn't going down without a fight. The warehouse district looked different at night. Shadows stretched between the buildings like dark fingers, and the sodium streetlights cast everything in sickly yellow pools. Frank parked a block away, checking his mirrors for any sign of being followed. The streets appeared empty, but he knew that meant nothing. He approached the warehouse from the back, using the key he'd had made weeks ago. The lock turned smoothly, and he slipped inside, leaving the door unlocked behind him, just in case he needed to run. The building felt different in the darkness. His footsteps echoed differently, and every creak of the old structure made him freeze. He made his way to the hidden room, his phone's flashlight cutting through the blackness. "You're early. I like punctuality." Frank spun toward the voice, his heart hammering. A figure emerged from the shadows near the far wall, a man in his 70s, tall and lean, with silver hair and dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Vincent Caruso. Frank didn't ask. He knew. Very good. Though most people who knew that name are dead now. Caruso stepped closer, his hands visible and empty. "Except you've been stirring up old ghosts, haven't you? I found the room by accident." "Nothing about you has been accidental, Frank. Do you think it's coincidence that this particular warehouse came up for sale at exactly the right price for your budget? That the previous owner was so eager to sell? Frank's blood chilled. You set this up. I've been watching this place for 27 years, waiting for the right person to find what I left behind. Someone with enough curiosity to dig deeper, but not enough official standing to make the wrong people pay attention. Caruso's smile was cold. You were perfect. Why? Why keep evidence of what you did? Frank kept his hand near his jacket, where the .38 waited. Sarah Chen found out something she shouldn't have. Sarah Chen was a very smart accountant who discovered that certain city contracts were being awarded based on factors other than merit. She had documentation, witnesses, bank records. Very thorough woman. And someone paid you to kill her. Someone paid me to make the problem disappear. But problems have a way of evolving. Caruso's eyes glittered in the flashlight beam. The person who hired me became mayor 6 months later, still sits in that office today, making decisions about development contracts, police budgets, who gets investigated and who doesn't. The pieces clicked into place in Frank's mind. You kept the evidence to blackmail them, to ensure my continued health and freedom. But I'm 74 years old, Frank. Prostate cancer. 6 months, maybe 8. I need someone to inherit my insurance policy. You're insane if you think. Look around you. Caruso gestured to the hidden room. You've already inherited it. The photos I sent prove you've been here, handled the evidence, kept secrets from the police. Detective Morrison would be very interested in that timeline. Frank's hand moved toward his gun, but Caruso raised a finger. Before you do something permanently stupid, consider this. Help me deliver justice that's 27 years overdue, and you'll have enough money to buy 10 warehouses. Refuse, and you'll spend your retirement years in prison for obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence in a murder case. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Frank realized he'd been maneuvered into this moment from the very beginning, each choice leading him deeper into a trap that had been waiting decades to spring. The weight of the gun in Frank's trembling hands felt both foreign and oddly comforting as he crept through the warehouse's main floor. Every shadow seemed to pulse with potential threat, every creak of the old building's bones making his heart skip. The fluorescent work lights he'd installed cast harsh pools of illumination that only made the darkness beyond them more impenetrable. He'd been a fool to come back here alone, but Detective Morrison's words echoed in his mind. When we can't protect you 24/7, and the police had done their sweep, collected what evidence they could from the hidden room, but Frank knew they'd missed something. They had to have. Whoever had been watching him, whoever had killed that woman 30 years ago, was still out there, still hunting. The floorboards groaned under his feet as he made his way toward the back corner where he'd first discovered the loose panel. His breath came in short, visible puffs in the cold air. Winter was settling over the city with a vengeance, and the warehouse's broken heating system made it feel like a tomb. Frank paused at the entrance to the hidden room, now stripped bare by the crime scene team. The walls looked naked without their macabre decorations, but somehow the emptiness was worse than the photos and newspaper clippings had been. It felt like a mouth screaming silently. A sound from somewhere deeper in the building made him freeze, not the settling of old wood or the scurrying of rats, something deliberate. Footsteps. His grip tightened on the revolver as he backed against the wall, trying to control his breathing. The smart thing would be to call for help, but his phone sat uselessly on his kitchen counter at home, forgotten in his panicked rush to return here. Something had been nagging at him all day, a detail that wouldn't let him rest. The footsteps grew closer, measured and unhurried. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide their presence anymore. Frank's mouth went dry as he realized what that meant. They knew he was here, had probably been waiting for him. Frank. The voice drifted through the darkness, cultured and calm. Male, probably older. I know you're here. There's no point hiding. Frank pressed himself deeper into the shadows of the hidden room, his heart hammering so hard he was sure it would give him away. The voice was familiar somehow, though he couldn't place it. "You've caused quite a stir, you know," the voice continued, closer now. 30 years of careful planning, and you stumble into my little sanctuary like some bumbling amateur treasure hunter. The footsteps stopped just outside the hidden room. Frank could see a shadow stretching across the floor, but not its source. His finger found the trigger of the revolver, though his hands shook so badly he wasn't sure he could hit anything if he tried. "Do you know what it's like," the voice said, almost conversational, "to watch your life's work get picked apart by incompetent police? To see evidence bags wheeled out of your sacred space like common garbage?" Frank's mind raced. Life's work? This wasn't just about one murder. This was about something much bigger. "I've been watching you for weeks, Frank. Did you know that? Following you home, learning your routines. You have such a simple life. Coffee at 8, hardware store by 10, back here to play contractor until dark. Quite touching, really. A man chasing his retirement dreams." A flashlight beam suddenly cut through the darkness, sweeping back and forth. Frank shrank further into the corner, but there was nowhere to go. The room was maybe 8 feet square with only one entrance. "The thing about sacred spaces," the voice continued, "is that they require maintenance, devotion, and occasionally sacrifice." The beam found him. Frank squinted into the harsh light, raising the gun with both hands. Behind the flashlight he could make out a tall figure in a dark coat, but the face remained hidden in shadow. "Mr. Patterson?" Frank's voice cracked with disbelief. The man who stepped into the light was indeed his real estate agent, the same Harold Patterson who had sold him the warehouse, who had insisted it was such a bargain, who had handled all the paperwork with suspicious efficiency. "Very good." Frank Patterson's smile was warm and grandfatherly, completely at odds with the situation. "Though I suspect you're wondering why your helpful real estate agent would want to hurt you. You killed that woman. Sarah Chen. Yes, among others. Such a lovely girl, though she asked far too many questions about certain property transactions." Patterson took a step closer, apparently unconcerned about the gun pointed at him. "Much like you, actually." Frank's finger tightened on the trigger, but Patterson raised his hand in a calming gesture. "Now, before you do something rash, let me explain why you're going to put that gun down and walk out of here with me quietly." Frank's hands trembled as he stared at the photo Detective Morrison had just placed on the kitchen table. It showed him entering the warehouse 3 days ago, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. The timestamp read 2:47 p.m., exactly when he'd gone to check on the contractors. "Someone's been documenting your every move," Morrison said, settling into the chair across from him. "We found this camera hidden in the old factory building across from your warehouse. Professional grade, motion activated." The coffee Frank had poured sat untouched, growing cold as the implications sank in. "How long has it been there?" "Based on the equipment, we estimate at least 6 months, maybe longer." Morrison pulled out a notebook. "Frank, I need you to think carefully. Have you noticed anyone following you? Any strange phone calls, unexpected visitors, anything out of the ordinary?" Frank's mind raced back through the past few weeks, the sensation of being watched that he'd dismissed as paranoia, the hang-up calls that had started shortly after he'd bought the warehouse, the man in the coffee shop who'd seemed familiar but disappeared before Frank could place him. "There was someone," he said slowly, "at Rosie's diner about a week ago. Older guy, maybe my age, sitting alone. When I looked at him, he got up and left real quick. I thought I'd seen him before, but can you describe him?" Morrison made notes. "We're going through the camera's memory card now. Hundreds of photos going back months. Someone's been very interested in that warehouse, Frank. The question is whether they knew what was hidden inside or if they were waiting for someone to find it." The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too warm. Frank stood and walked to the window, peering through the blinds at his quiet street. Everything looked normal. Parked cars, a neighbor walking their dog, kids riding bikes, but now it all felt like a stage set, hiding something sinister. "What about the evidence from the hidden room?" he asked, without turning around. "The lab's processing everything, But it's going to take time. 23-year-old evidence isn't easy to analyze, especially when it's been exposed to warehouse conditions for so long. Morrison's voice carried a note of frustration. But the victim's jewelry confirmed it. This is definitely connected to the Rebecca Chen murder. Frank remembered the newspaper clippings he'd read online. Rebecca Chen, 28 years old, an accountant who disappeared on her way home from work. Her body had never been found, but blood evidence and signs of struggle in the parking garage had pointed to murder. The case had dominated headlines for months before going cold. The killer kept trophies, Frank said, still staring out the window. That's what psychologists say, right? They keep mementos to relive the crime. That's the theory. But why hide them in a warehouse? And why risk exposure by monitoring the place so closely? Morrison joined him at the window. Unless what? Unless there's more than just evidence hidden in that building. We've only searched the one room. What if there's something else? Something the killer can't afford to lose? The possibility hit Frank like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on the hidden room that he hadn't considered there might be other secrets buried in the warehouse's maze of corridors and forgotten spaces. The building was massive, with multiple levels and countless alcoves where someone could conceal almost anything. We need to search every inch of that place, he said. Morrison nodded. Already in progress. But Frank, I need you to understand something. If the killer is willing to monitor the warehouse for months, if they're desperate enough to take those kinds of risks, then you're in serious danger. This isn't just about old evidence anymore. A car pulled up across the street, and Frank's pulse spiked until he recognized his neighbor's Honda. Every shadow, every movement now carried potential threat. The comfortable routine of his retirement had been shattered, replaced by a constant state of vigilance that left him exhausted. I should have left well enough alone, he muttered. No, Morrison said firmly. Rebecca Chen's family deserves justice. They've been waiting 23 years for answers. What you found could finally give them closure. Frank's phone buzzed on the table. A text from an unknown number. Stop digging or join her. Morrison was beside him instantly, reading over his shoulder. Her hand moved to her service weapon as she scanned the street through the window. Pack a bag, she said. You're not staying here tonight. But as Frank looked at the message again, a terrible realization crept over him. The killer wasn't just watching anymore. They were ready to act. Frank's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph Detective Morrison had slid across the diner table. The black and white image showed a much younger version of Harold Kemper standing beside a police cruiser, his uniform crisp and his smile confident. The caption read, Officer Harold Kemper receives commendation for outstanding service, 1987. He was a cop, Frank whispered, his coffee growing cold between his palms. Morrison nodded grimly. 23 years on the force, retired in 1995 with full honors, model officer by all accounts, clean record, community involvement, the works. She paused, studying Frank's pale face, which is exactly why no one ever suspected him. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn vinyl booth. Frank felt dizzy, the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves in his mind with sickening clarity. A police officer would have access to crime scenes, would know investigative procedures, would understand exactly how to avoid detection. More importantly, he would have been in a position to influence the very investigation meant to catch him. The Blackwood murder case, Morrison continued, her voice low. Kemper wasn't the lead detective, but he was part of the team, had access to all the evidence, all the witness statements. He knew exactly what the department was looking for, what leads they were following. Frank's throat felt dry, and he made sure they never found it. Worse than that. I've been going through the old case files since yesterday. Key pieces of evidence went missing during the investigation. Witness statements were misfiled. Leads that should have been followed were somehow overlooked. Morrison's jaw tightened. He didn't just hide his tracks. He actively sabotaged the investigation from the inside. The implications crashed over Frank like a cold wave. How many others? That's what we're trying to determine. The murders I mentioned yesterday, the ones with similar patterns, they all occurred during Kemper's tenure, and in every case he managed to insert himself into the investigation somehow. Sometimes as backup, sometimes as evidence transport, always finding a way to get close to the case. Frank pushed the photograph back across the table, unable to look at that confident smile any longer. He's been killing people for decades. We think so. But, Frank, here's what really concerns me. After Sarah Blackwood's murder in 1988, there was a significant gap. No similar killings for years. Then suddenly, about 6 months ago, we start seeing the pattern again. The blood drained from Frank's face. 6 months ago, right around the time he'd started seriously looking at properties, including the warehouse. You think buying the warehouse triggered something? I think you buying that specific warehouse was never a coincidence. Morrison leaned forward intently. That hidden room wasn't just a storage space for old trophies. It was his shrine, his private museum. And when you stumbled onto it, you didn't just discover his secret, you desecrated it. Frank's mind raced back to those first weeks in the warehouse. The strange feeling of being watched, the subtle signs that someone had been inside. He's been coming back. More than that, we found additional evidence this morning, recent evidence. Morrison's expression grew grave. Frank, he's not just angry about you finding his hiding place. He's planning something big, something that involves you directly. The diner suddenly felt suffocating. Frank glanced around at the other patrons, an elderly couple sharing pie, a trucker reading a newspaper, a young mother feeding her toddler. Any of them could be Kemper. Anyone could be watching. What kind of evidence? Morrison hesitated, then pulled out another photograph. This one was in color, clearly recent. It showed the interior of Frank's own apartment, taken from the window. His kitchen table was visible, along with the case files he'd been studying just 2 nights ago. We found this in his car, along with detailed notes about your daily routine. He knows where you shop, where you eat, what time you leave for the warehouse each morning. Morrison's voice carried a weight that made Frank's stomach clench. He's been planning this for weeks. Frank stared at the photograph, recognizing his own coffee mug on the table, his reading glasses beside the files. The violation felt overwhelming, but underneath the fear, something else was building. Anger. Pure, clean anger at this monster who had stolen so many lives and now presumed to orchestrate his. What's the plan? Frank asked, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Morrison looked surprised. The plan is to keep you safe, protective custody until we can... No. Frank met her eyes directly. He's been playing this game for 30 years, always staying one step ahead, but now he's made a mistake. He's let it become personal. Frank tapped the photograph. He wants me? Good. Let's give him what he wants. Morrison shook her head immediately. Absolutely not. You're a civilian, Frank. This isn't some vigilante movie. You're right, Frank said quietly. This is real life. And, in real life, sometimes the only way to catch a monster is to let him think he's already won. The basement felt like a tomb as Frank crouched behind the old furnace, his phone's battery icon glowing red in the corner of the screen. 18%. Maybe enough for one more call if he was lucky. The footsteps above had stopped moving, which somehow made everything worse. At least when the killer was pacing, Frank knew where he was. Detective Sarah Chen had promised backup was coming. But how long could he hide down here? The basement had no other exit. He'd checked that thoroughly when he first bought the place. Just the wooden stairs leading up to the main floor, where someone who'd already killed once was waiting for him. A soft creak made Frank's blood freeze. The top step, then another. The killer was coming down. Frank pressed himself deeper into the shadows behind the furnace, trying to control his breathing. His arthritic knees screamed in protest from the cramped position, but he didn't dare move. Through the gap between the furnace and the wall, he could see a sliver of the staircase. A work boot appeared on the bottom step, then another. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, sweeping a flashlight beam across the basement. Frank caught a glimpse of the intruder's profile in the reflected light, definitely the man from the coffee shop, the one who'd been watching him for weeks. Up close, He looked younger than Frank had expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of lean build that suggested he stayed in shape. "I know you're down here, Frank." The voice was calm, almost conversational. "We need to talk." Frank's hand tightened around his phone. The killer was maybe 20 feet away, moving toward the old workbench on the far side of the basement. If Frank was quiet, if he timed it right, maybe he could slip up the stairs while the man was distracted. "You found Elena's things, didn't you?" The flashlight beam swept closer to Frank's hiding spot. "That was smart, figuring out where I hid them. Took me years to perfect that hiding place. Even had the cops crawling all over this building back in '98, and they never found it." "She was going to ruin everything," the man continued, his voice taking on an edge. "Elena thought she could blackmail me, threaten to expose what she'd seen. But she underestimated me. Buying this place was supposed to solve my last problem. I was going to tear it down, destroy what was left. But then you had to play hero, didn't you? Couldn't just flip it and walk away." Frank's phone buzzed against his palm. A text message. The sound was barely audible, but in the silence of the basement it might as well have been a fire alarm. The footsteps stopped. "There you are." The flashlight beam swung toward the furnace, pinning Frank in its glare like a deer in headlights. He scrambled to his feet, his knee buckling slightly, and found himself face to face with Elena Vasquez's killer. "Detective Morrison," Frank said, recognition hitting him like a physical blow. The man from the coffee shop, the one who'd been watching him. It was Detective Robert Morrison from Sarah Chen's department. No wonder he'd known so much about the investigation. Morrison smiled, but it was the coldest expression Frank had ever seen. "Very good, though I suppose my cover was blown the moment you started working with Chen. She's thorough, I'll give her that. Been making my life very difficult lately. I protected myself and my family." "You think a detective's salary was enough to put 3 kids through college? To pay for my wife's cancer treatments?" Morrison's grip tightened on the flashlight, and Frank could see a gun in his other hand. "Elena saw me taking money from an evidence bust. She wanted 50,000 to keep quiet. So, you killed her. I solved a problem, just like I'm going to solve you." Morrison raised the gun. "This will look like a tragic accident. Elderly man falls down basement stairs while working on his renovation. Very sad." Frank's phone chose that moment to ring, the sound echoing off the basement walls. Sarah Chen's name flashed on the screen. "Don't answer that," Morrison said, but Frank was already swiping to accept the call. "Sarah," Frank shouted before Morrison could stop him. "It's Detective Morrison. He's in the basement with me. He's the one who killed Elena." Morrison lunged forward, but Frank dodged to the side, putting the furnace between them. The phone clattered to the concrete floor, but the call was still connected. "Frank!" Sarah's voice crackled from the speaker. "We're 30 seconds out. Keep talking." Morrison's face twisted with rage as the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder by the second. The abandoned subway tunnel stretched ahead like a throat waiting to swallow them whole. Frank's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rusted rails and debris scattered across the concrete floor. Sarah stayed close behind him, her own light sweeping the walls for any sign of movement. "How much farther?" she whispered, though her voice still echoed in the oppressive silence. Frank checked his phone's GPS, grateful for the weak signal that somehow penetrated this deep underground. Quarter mile, maybe less. The warehouse foundation should be directly above us soon. They'd been walking for 20 minutes since entering through the maintenance access Sarah had found in the city records. The tunnel had been sealed off decades ago when this section of the subway was rerouted, but the entrance remained hidden behind a utility building 6 blocks from Frank's warehouse. A sound ahead made them both freeze, metal scraping against concrete, deliberate and rhythmic. Frank clicked off his flashlight and motioned for Sarah to do the same. In the absolute darkness, the scraping became louder, more defined. Someone was moving something heavy across the tunnel floor. They pressed against the curved wall, feeling their way forward inch by inch. Frank's heart hammered so loud he was certain it would give them away. The arthritis in his knees protested every careful step, but adrenaline kept him moving. A dim glow appeared around the tunnel's curve ahead. Not electric light, something warmer, more flickering. Candles or a lantern. Frank eased his head around the corner and had to bite back a gasp. The tunnel opened into a wider maintenance chamber, and the space had been transformed into a workshop of horrors. Tables lined the walls, covered with photographs, documents, and items that gleamed dully in the lantern light. On the far wall, a massive corkboard displayed what looked like surveillance photos, dozens of them, all featuring Frank. At his warehouse, at the coffee shop, walking to his car, sleeping in his own bed. But it was the figure hunched over one of the tables that made Frank's blood turn to ice. Detective Ray Coleman sorted through a collection of evidence bags with methodical precision, occasionally making notes in a thick journal. He'd shed his rumpled coat, revealing muscular arms that spoke of hours spent in the gym despite his advancing years. This wasn't the tired, worn-down cop Frank had met at the warehouse. This was someone else entirely, focused, energetic, almost manic in his attention to detail. Sarah's sharp intake of breath behind him made Coleman's head snap up. "I was wondering when you'd find your way down here," Coleman said, setting down his pen with careful deliberation. "Though I expected you to come alone, Frank. Bringing a reporter complicates things." Frank stepped into the chamber, keeping his hands visible. "How long have you been watching me?" "Since the day you bought the warehouse. Did you really think a property like that would sit on the market without someone keeping an eye on it?" Coleman stood slowly, his hand drifting toward his service weapon. "I've been protecting that room for 23 years, making sure the city condemned the building, scaring off other potential buyers, maintaining my little insurance policy." "Insurance policy?" Sarah moved to Frank's side, her recorder already running. Coleman smiled, and Frank realized he'd never seen the detective look genuinely happy before. It was terrifying. You don't stay a cop for 30 years without making enemies. Politicians who don't like their corruption exposed, criminals who hold grudges, internal affairs breathing down your neck. Sometimes you need leverage, evidence that implicates people higher up the food chain than some small-time dealer like Marcus Webb. Frank felt the pieces clicking into place. You killed Webb. Webb was going to roll on his suppliers who had very important friends at City Hall. I was asked to make the problem disappear. Coleman's hand rested on his gun now. $20,000 to take care of one junkie dealer. Easiest money I ever made, but you kept evidence. To protect yourself. "Insurance," Coleman repeated. "Photos of my meeting with the deputy mayor, recordings of our conversations, documentation of the money transfer, all safely hidden where only I could find it. Until a stubborn old man decided to play real estate developer." Sarah stepped forward slightly. "The bodies in the basement, there are more than just Webb." Coleman's smile widened. "Webb was my first, but not my last. Turns out I had a talent for solving problems. The basement became quite useful over the years." Frank's mind raced. They were trapped underground with a serial killer who'd been hiding behind a badge for decades. His phone had no signal this deep, and Coleman stood between them and the only exit they knew about. "Here's what's going to happen," Coleman continued, drawing his weapon. "You're both going to have a tragic accident down here. Collapsed tunnel, very sad. By the time anyone finds you, I'll have relocated my collection to a safer location." Frank grabbed Sarah's hand, feeling for the small canister of pepper spray she'd shown him earlier. They had one chance. Frank's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph Riley had just placed on the table between them. The coffee shop's ambient noise faded to a distant hum as the image burned itself into his memory. A young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, frozen in time at what should have been the beginning of her life. "Maria Santos," Riley said quietly. 23 years old, art student at the community college. She disappeared on a Tuesday night in October, 15 years ago. Frank picked up the photograph with reverent care, as if handling something sacred. She was so young. Her family never gave up hope. They held vigils every year on the anniversary, posted flyers around the neighborhood until the weather destroyed them, then posted new ones. Riley's voice carried the weight of countless similar cases. Her mother died 3 years ago, still believing Maria might walk through the door someday. The warehouse's hidden room flashed through Frank's mind. The carefully preserved evidence, the methodical documentation, the shrine-like quality of it all. Whoever did this, they kept trophies. More than that, they kept detailed records, times, locations, methods. Riley leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Frank, based on what you found, we think Maria wasn't the only victim." Frank's coffee grew cold as Riley explained the investigation's rapid developments. The evidence from the hidden room had triggered a comprehensive review of cold cases spanning 2 decades. Missing persons reports that had seemed unconnected were now revealing a disturbing pattern. "The killer was selective," Riley continued. "Young women, usually students or new to the area. People whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive search efforts. They were careful, methodical, and they've been watching me since I bought the warehouse." Frank rubbed his temples, trying to process the enormity of what he'd stumbled into. The break-ins, the feeling of being followed, they weren't paranoia. Riley nodded grimly. "We've had units monitoring your building and neighborhood, but this person has stayed ahead of us for 15 years. They know how to remain invisible." Frank thought about the past few weeks, the subtle signs he'd initially dismissed, the growing certainty that his life was no longer his own. What happens now? "We need your help." Riley's directness surprised him. "You're the key to drawing them out. They're obsessed with maintaining control over their narrative, and your discovery threatens that. They won't be able to stay away. You want me as bait. I want to give you a choice." Riley spread several documents across the table. "We can relocate you, set you up somewhere safe until we catch them, or you can help us end this." Frank studied the papers, witness protection protocols, safety guarantees, a chance to disappear from this nightmare entirely. But Maria Santos's photograph lay beside them, and he couldn't shake the image of her family's 15-year vigil. "If I help, what exactly are you asking me to do?" "Return to your normal routine. We'll have surveillance teams positioned throughout the area, but you'll appear to be alone and vulnerable. When they make their move, and they will, we'll be ready." Frank considered the risks. At 65, he'd lived a full life, though not always the one he'd planned. His retirement dreams seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of finally delivering justice for Maria Santos and the other victims. "There's something else," Riley added hesitantly. "The evidence suggests this person has been using the warehouse for years, possibly as their primary base of operations. They know every inch of that building, every hiding spot, every escape route. You think they'll try to go back?" "I think they can't help themselves. That room wasn't just storage, it was their sanctuary. Losing access to it will drive them to take increasingly desperate risks." Frank made his decision with surprising clarity. "What do you need me to do?" Riley outlined the plan with military precision. Frank would return to the warehouse, maintain his renovation work, and follow his established patterns. Undercover officers would pose as construction workers, utility inspectors, and neighborhood residents. Every approach to the building would be monitored. "The most dangerous moment will be inside the warehouse," Riley warned. "If they get past our perimeter, you'll be alone with them until backup arrives." Frank pocketed Maria Santos's photograph. "How long do you think it will take?" "Based on their previous behavior patterns, not long. They're already agitated, already taking risks they wouldn't normally take. The pressure will force them into the open." "Detective Riley," he said, as they reached the parking lot, "when this is over, I want to meet Maria's family. They deserve to know their daughter's story will finally be told." Riley nodded, understanding the weight of that promise. "We'll make sure of it." Frank's hands trembled as he pressed the phone to his ear, Detective Sarah Chen's number already dialing. The warehouse felt different now. Every shadow seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, every creak of the old building a potential threat. Through the grimy windows, the first hints of dawn were breaking across the city's skyline. Chen. Sarah, it's Frank. He was here, in my warehouse, tonight. A pause. Frank, slow down. Who was there? The killer, Marcus Webb. He left me a note. Frank's voice cracked as he read the message aloud. You've been very helpful, Frank. Time to finish what I started. Don't touch anything else. I'm on my way. Frank ended the call and sank onto an overturned crate, his retirement dreams now a distant memory. How had his simple real estate investment turned into this nightmare? The hidden room behind the false wall seemed to mock him, 23 years of evidence that should have remained buried. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Look outside. Frank's blood turned to ice. With unsteady legs, he approached the window facing the street. A figure stood beneath the broken streetlight across from the warehouse, too far away to make out clearly but unmistakably human. As Frank watched, the figure raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Then the lights went out. The warehouse plunged into complete darkness. Frank fumbled for his phone's flashlight, the weak beam barely penetrating the oppressive blackness surrounding him. His breathing echoed off the walls as he tried to orient himself, remembering the layout of debris and obstacles between him and the exit. A sound stopped him cold, the screech of the main door sliding open. "Hello, Frank?" The voice carried across the warehouse floor, calm and conversational. "I have to say, you've exceeded my expectations." Frank killed his phone light and pressed himself against a support beam, hoping to blend into the shadows. His heart hammered so loudly he was certain it would give away his position. 23 years, the voice continued, closer now. 23 years I've watched this place, making sure no one got too curious. Then you show up with your little renovation plans. A soft chuckle. Do you know how many buyers I scared away before you? Frank held his breath, trying to track the voice's movement. The killer was circling, hunting. The Hendricks family was my masterpiece, Webb continued, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. A crime of passion, they would have called it, if they'd ever found the evidence. But I was smarter than that. Or so I thought. Frank's phone vibrated. Another text. The brief screen illumination felt like a spotlight, and he quickly muted the device. But it was too late. There you are. You can't leave, Frank. You know too much now. You've seen my collection. Frank reached the hidden room. His sanctuary turned trap. He slammed the door and threw the makeshift lock, knowing it would only buy him minutes. The evidence boxes surrounded him like silent witnesses, photographs, documents, personal items from the Hendricks family that Webb had kept as trophies. His phone showed 2 bars of signal. He dialed 911. 911. What's your emergency? This is Frank Martinez at the warehouse on Industrial Boulevard. The killer is here, Marcus Webb. He's trying to... The door exploded inward. Webb stood silhouetted in the doorway, holding a crowbar. In the phone's glow, Frank could see his face clearly for the first time, ordinary features twisted by decades of buried guilt and rage. Hang up the phone, Frank. The police are already coming, Frank said, backing against the far wall. Detective Chen knows everything. Then I suppose we'll have to make this quick. Webb stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the evidence boxes with something like nostalgia. You know, I used to come here sometimes, just to remember, to relive that night. Sarah Hendricks begged so beautifully. Frank's grip tightened on his phone. Why? Why kill them? James Hendricks discovered my little accounting irregularities at the firm, threatened to expose me. I only meant to scare him, but... Webb shrugged. These things escalate. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Webb's expression hardened. Looks like our time is up, Frank. He raised the crowbar, but Frank was ready. Years of construction work had left him stronger than he looked. He lunged forward, tackling Webb around the waist. They crashed into the evidence boxes, photographs scattering like fallen leaves. The sirens were almost here now. Frank held on desperately as Webb struggled beneath him, the crowbar clattering away into the darkness. 23 years of secret spilled around them, finally ready to see the light. The warehouse groaned around Frank as he crouched behind the rusted machinery, his heart hammering against his ribs. Detective Morrison's backup was still minutes away, and those minutes felt like hours stretching into eternity. The killer's footsteps echoed through the cavernous space, methodical and patient, like a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. Frank's fingers trembled as he clutched the evidence folder against his chest. The photographs, the bloody clothes, the journal that detailed every horrific moment of Sarah Chen's murder 23 years ago. All of it proof that would finally put this monster away if Frank could just survive long enough to see it happen. A shadow moved across the grimy window above, and Frank realized with growing horror that the killer wasn't just hunting him from the ground floor. He was moving systematically, checking every possible hiding spot with the thoroughness of someone who knew this building intimately. "You know, Frank," the voice called out, "closer now. I have to admire your persistence. Most people would have walked away after the first warning, but not you. You just couldn't leave well enough alone." Frank pressed himself deeper into the shadows, trying to control his ragged breathing. Through a gap in the machinery, he could see a flashlight beam sweeping across the floor, moving in a grid pattern, professional, methodical. This wasn't the killer's first hunt. Sarah Chen thought she was clever too, the voice continued, conversational now, as if they were discussing the weather. Always asking questions, always poking around where she didn't belong. "Do you know what her last words were, Frank?" she begged. "Just like you're going to." The footsteps stopped directly on the other side of Frank's hiding spot. He could hear breathing, slow and controlled. Frank closed his eyes and tried to become invisible, every muscle in his body coiled tight as piano wire. Then the footsteps moved on, and Frank allowed himself a shaky breath. His phone buzzed with a text message, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. Frank's blood turned to ice as the footsteps immediately reversed direction, no longer casual but purposeful and fast. Frank bolted from his hiding spot as a hand crashed through the gap where his head had been moments before. He stumbled toward the stairs, his 65-year-old legs protesting every step, but adrenaline carrying him forward. Behind him he could hear the killer giving chase, no longer bothering with stealth. The stairs to the second floor were treacherous, several steps missing entirely, others sagging under his weight. Frank hauled himself up using the rickety railing, splinters digging into his palms. He could hear the killer behind him, gaining ground with the easy confidence of someone decades younger. Frank reached the second floor and immediately saw his mistake. There was nowhere to go. The floor was mostly gone, leaving only a narrow walkway around the perimeter and a few isolated platforms connected by questionable beams. Below yawned a 20-foot drop to the concrete floor. "End of the line, Frank." Frank turned to see the killer emerge from the stairwell, no longer hiding behind shadows and anonymity. It was exactly who Frank had suspected after finding the journal. Detective Ray Kowalski, Morrison's former partner, the man who had been feeding information about the investigation from the very beginning. "You know," Kowalski said, pulling a gun from his jacket, "when I heard you'd bought this place, I thought it was just bad luck. Then you found the room, and I realized maybe it was fate. Maybe it was time to tie up all the loose ends." "Morrison knows," Frank said, backing carefully along the narrow walkway. "She knows you're here. She'll figure it out." Kowalski laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Morrison's a good cop, but she trusts her instincts, and her instincts tell her that her old partner wouldn't hurt a fly. By the time she figures it out, you'll be just another unfortunate accident." Old man exploring a condemned building, fell through the rotted floor. Tragic, really. Frank's heel bumped against something solid behind him, a support beam. He was running out of walkway, and Kowalski was raising the gun. But then Frank heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens, multiple units, getting closer by the second. Kowalski heard them too, his confident expression flickering for just a moment. "Doesn't matter," Kowalski said, steadying his aim. I'll be long gone before they get up here. Frank clutched the evidence folder tighter and made his choice. Instead of backing away, he lunged forward, tackling Kowalski around the waist. The gun went off, the bullet whining past Frank's ear, and both men crashed to the unstable floor. The rotted planks gave way immediately. Frank had one last glimpse of Detective Morrison bursting through the warehouse door below, her weapon drawn, her face turned up toward them in horror. Then he was falling, the evidence folder scattered around him like confetti, 23 years of hidden truth finally floating free in the dusty air. The last thing Frank saw before hitting the concrete was Kowalski's surprised face, justice finally catching up with him after all these years.